Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. And welcome to my Did They Stack Up series. Today we'll be talking about McLaren. Did McLaren stack up to the teams around them? Did they stack up to my preseason predictions? And did the drivers stack up to the drivers around them? What did they end up for my preseason predictions versus the actual driver standings? Well, today we will be looking at those things. And to start us off, we will start with this nice little chart here that shows that McLaren entered the Constructors' Championship in 4th position officially. And where did I predict them in my preseason prediction? I predicted them 8th. So they were quite a bit farther up the grid than I had predicted. In that nice preseason testing phase, they were looking fairly horrible, and I was not predicting that they would actually increase throughout the season to really get them anywhere near the front of the pack. Now, they surprised me, and gladly so, that they actually were able to turn things around so quickly and so readily to get back into the constructors' standings side of things, and the driver's side of things as well. So instead of my preseason prediction of 8th, my in-season rating ended up in 3rd. Now, how did I come up with my in-season rating? Well, I took each driver and I rated them from 1 to 10 for each race that they participated in. And then I averaged its ratings for those drivers and ended up with a score of 7.14 that was assigned to McLaren. Now that put them in rank 3, so that made it to the podium standings after my dismal preseason prediction of 8th overall. So they increased quite significantly and were able to turn things around. I think that was mainly due to that early recognition that they had chose the wrong way to go at the very beginning and basically stopped all progress and switched gears way early on the race season, or even potentially before the race season started. So it had a little bit of lag there for them to get back up to snuff with the rest of the field. But once they did, they came out strong in that regards. Now we have the two drivers, Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. Oscar Piastri in official drivers championship was 9th. I had predicted him 16th, so quite a bit down the grid, as I explained earlier. And my in-season rating was ranked 8th, so a little bit higher than his official standings with a score of 6.73. So I think Oscar actually did a really good job in that McLaren, even though that McLaren was fairly poor at the very beginning of the season, and was able to get the most out of that, really shining as well as Lando in this season. And if you look at Lando, he's officially 6th position in the Drivers' Championship. I had ranked him at 12th in my preseason. As I explained earlier, I didn't think they were going to make it that far up in that progression, so I didn't think they would actually get that many points. And so that pushed him farther down in my preseason. But in the actual Drivers' season rating for the season, I gave him a 3rd position. So he made it on the podium with a score of 7.55. So if you also look at the differences between Oscar and Lando in my preseason predictions versus where they ended up in the official standings, that's pretty close, even though my in-season ratings ranked Lando a little bit higher than that gap pertains. So I think Lando did a better job overall, but that's kind of expected as he is returning and Oscar is the newcomer to the field. So without further ado, we will see how the two drivers compare to each other throughout this season. And we have Oscar Piastri in blue versus Lando Norris in red in this graph. And of course, this is the each season race at the bottom and their position in each of those races along the x-axis. So we have 20th position at the top, which is not where you want to be. You want to be down at the bottom in that first position. So the lower on this graph you are, the better. Now I also have a couple of trend lines here for each driver. As you can see, they're going down, which is actually a good thing because that's where you want to be, is the lower positions. So they were both gaining and getting better throughout the season, which is always good to see. and you can kind of compare the two drivers throughout the season. So they started off, fairly poorly because of that McLaren not having the aerodynamics package that they needed to in that beginning phase of this season. And then once that kicked in, they really shined for the most part of the rest of the season. And you can kind of see how they predicted for each race. So they kind of mirrored each other, which is always good to see that they're getting the most out of that, with a few exceptions where drivers would have issues and go off. And so that's why you kind of ignore the 20th positions in general for these kind of graphs, but they're there just to kind of give you an idea of how well each driver did for each race and how they compared to their teammates in this running. So you can see Lando basically doing a much better job in general than Oscar Piastri, even though Oscar Piastri was fairly close to Lando for most of the season and overtook him on a couple of occasions. So in that regard, Oscar Piastri is doing a really good job for his rookie year and really performing well. He just didn't have the long haul for the races, I think, that he'll master with that help of the team. But you can kind of see, him kind of following the same track, so you can kind of see where the McLaren was good and where they were bad throughout the season as well. So it's good to see the two teammates compared to each other and where they ended up overall. So now we will see where Oscar Piastri was against his two drivers that were close to him at the end of the season. So we have Lance Stroll in that 10th position with 74 points behind him. And then, of course, George Russell ahead of him with 175 points in that 8th position. So there's quite a bit of gap there. But for that 8th position, but he was, ahead of Lance Stroll in that 10th position for a decent amount of points as well. And this looks like a kind of a chaotic graph here. Again, you have the races at the bottom and the position that they were on the x-axis. And we can see that, George Russell and had quite a bit of offs during this season. As well did Lance Stroll near the end of the season. He started off strong with that Aston Martin and kind of got worse as that time went on, where George was kind of consistent up and down. When he made mistakes, it was bad, but overall he was doing a decent job getting into the points. Of course, that 10 marker there in the middle of this graph across the board is where you want to be below to get official driver standing points and constructors points as well as in that regard. So anything below that is good. And of course, we have the trend lines here to kind of show you how things are going. And we can see that Lance Stroll was kind of decreasing as the season went on and kind of getting worse, mainly because that Aston Martin could not maintain that update pace as the rest of the cars in that field. But you have George Russell, which is pretty much a nice steady line across the board. And you have Oscar Piastri, which is gaining ground. So he was actually improving as the season went on. Of course, that's kind of matches with the McLaren as well, with that preseason having issues at the very beginning of the season because they didn't have the right direction that they went in and then switched directions and then kicked in later. So that's part of that graph as well. So you have to keep that in mind. But overall, I think that's a kind of good indication of how the drivers ended up throughout the season, and you can kind of gauge them on that through this graph. You can definitely see that George Russell was ahead of both Oscar and Lance in this positioning throughout the season, even though he had quite a few offs that pushed him back in the back of the field. So where did Lando kind of come up in the same situation? So we have Lando in 6th position with 205 points. And just behind him in 7th was Carlos Sainz with 200 points. And just ahead of him was Charles Leclerc, with 206 points. So just ahead of him in that 5th position. And so you can see here, again, Lando is in blue. So that's what you're going to kind of concentrate on, comparative to the yellow and red. And you can see here that Lando started off the season fairly poorly, only gaining points out of those 3 races out of the 6 or 7 races there at the very beginning. And then he had that nice streak that he was started making points every race after that. And so as soon as that Canada race, went by, he started really performing well in that McLaren, kind of matching to some degree what the 2 drivers ahead of him were doing, even though we see the Ferrari drivers having a lot more offs at the end of this season, both having some pretty significant issues. But at the beginning of the season, they were closer together, matching those point ranges. But you can kind of compare to how well Lando was doing in that mid-season to late season to those drivers compared to where that McLaren was at the beginning of the season. So that helps out a tremendous amount on his driver capability from the McLaren versus the Ferrari in this instance. And of course, we have a couple of gaps where drivers were not actually in the race. And of course, we have the gap where Lando Norris had that issue in Vegas as well. So there's not quite a line there in that last bit. But again, you can see the trend lines. So Lando Norris getting much better throughout the season, mainly because of that McLaren performance increased significantly when they made that major upgrade to that car. And then you have Carlos Sainz slightly getting worse throughout the season. And then you have Charles Leclerc actually getting better throughout the season as well. So in that regard, how they matched up, I think pretty well with Charles Leclerc, maybe with Carlos Sainz as well. It's hard to say. He had some of those issues with offs which kind of bumped up that trend line at the end of the season. Partly probably due to his fault, partly not due to his fault. So you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. So I think he's more on a par with them, even though it shows a decrease in that line. So where do they end up with the teams? And so this is just how the teams ended up, how many points they gained for each race across the season. And the trend lines here, and of course the trend lines going up are now good because that's the more points you're getting throughout the season. And the ones that are going down are bad. So you can see Aston Martin in red here in 5th place with 280 points versus McLaren's 302 points and Ferrari's 406 points. But you can see Aston Martin started off strong and got worse as the season went on. That decrease, not gaining near as many points at the end of the season as they did at the beginning. And then you have Ferrari in yellow, which is a slight increase throughout the season, even though it wasn't as high as they would have liked compared to the McLaren in blue, which had a horrible beginning of the season and a much better end of the season. So that's kind of what this graph shows you is the trend lines, and you can kind of get a rough picture idea of the points where they were scored in the season. And finally, we come to the step graph between the 3 teams. Again, we have Ferrari in yellow with 406 points in 3rd, ahead of the 2 other teams, McLaren and Aston Martin, where the McLaren in blue with 302 and Aston Martin in 280. So you can see here that Aston Martin started off strong and then kind of flattened out near that mid-season and really didn't gain much ground since then. Whereas you see Ferrari, a nice steady increase throughout this season, gaining that position from Aston Martin around the Netherlands. And then you have McLaren at the bottom there, had a poor beginning of the season, but then came out strong at the mid-season, gaining ground, kind of parallel lines to Ferrari from that point on, where he gained a lot of ground. So not quite where they needed to be to really overtake Ferrari, but they definitely were gaining ground, and because of Aston Martin's stalled in that mid-season for points, they were able to overtake them for that fourth position. So that kind of gives you a good look of how McLaren stacked up against the teams around them and how the drivers stacked up against the drivers that were around them. What was your thoughts on them? And coming up, we'll have how did Ferrari stack up? And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like. And if you wanted to see my Ferrari stack up video, I'd appreciate a subscribe as well so you don't miss that video when it comes out. And thank you very much for listening, and see you on the grid.